I am joined by midwife and author Leah Hazard. Leah's here today to talk to me about her new book, Womb, the inside story of where we all began. Hi, Leah. Thanks very much for joining me.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
I wanted to start off first of all because you are a midwife, right? You are a trained and practicing midwife. So can you tell us a little bit about your background, please? Because you didn't really intend to get into midwifery, did you?
This is as much a surprise to me as it is to anybody else. I never, ever would have expected to be a midwife. I grew up in America, where the role of a midwife is very different from what it is here in the UK. And I think it's a role that I maybe only even heard about vaguely growing up. So it wasn't on my radar at all. My first degree at uni was in English and American literature and language. And I was aiming to go actually and do something in theatre. I was really interested in directing, and I did a lot of that at uni. So I went to uni the first time around in America, where I grew up, and then I came over to Glasgow to do a master's degree in directing. And I shortly thereafter met my now husband, which probably explains a lot about why I'm still here. And when I finished my master's degree, I did work in telly actually for a while as a researcher, kind of behind the scenes. And I had my first daughter in 2003. And that was really, I guess, kind of the game changer for me, because I had a kind of classically rubbish first birth, found the whole experience pretty shocking and surprising, and I guess you could say traumatizing in some ways. And the more I spoke to other women who'd had babies around the same time, it seemed like we all kind of had a very similar experience in that, although we thought we had been really well prepared and had been good little girls and gone to all the classes and read the books and so on, the whole experience was nothing like what we had come to expect. So I did go back to work in television for a little while after my daughter was born, but I just, kind of very quickly hit the glass ceiling, and also simultaneously was becoming kind of consumed with this thorny issue of why pregnancy and birth had been so challenging, and I felt the system had kind of let me down. And I'd always been interested in women's health, but these things kind of all came together in a bit of a perfect storm, and I left my job. At that point in time, I really wasn't ready to go back to school because I had just done kind of 5 years of uni. Then I found out about the role of a doula, which is sort of a lay birth companion, non-clinical, just for emotional and practical support. And that seemed to fit in really well with my values and where I was with my young family at the time. So I actually worked as a doula, attending home and hospital births across central Scotland for about 6 years. In that time, I had another child. Birth was completely different, happy to report. And then when my girls were a little bit older, I felt like the time was right to really go for it and to be able to train to provide the full package, as it were. So I began my midwifery studies in 2010 and I qualified in 2013, and here I am. So it's just coming up to 10 years in midwifery.
Obviously, you have an interest in female reproductive health, but what made you want to write specifically about the womb? Why was that such a fascinating subject for you?
What made me want to write about the womb was I knew after Hard Push that I wanted to keep writing. I knew that it would be something in the sphere of reproductive health or maternity or women's issues in some way. For a while, I couldn't really figure out the lens through which to do that. I couldn't really figure out kind of the hook. And then I literally was just sitting at my desk, or actually my daughter's desk underneath her bunk bed, which is where I do all my work. One afternoon, I think it was maybe November 2020 or so, around about that time. And I just sent an email to my agent. I just had this idea, and she's an amazing woman. She's great for sort of bouncing ideas off, and she usually says no, which is fine. So I had this idea. I sent her this kind of two-line email, and I said, why hasn't anyone written a book about the womb? There are all kinds of books about other body parts and systems, and they do very well, and the bookshops are full of them. But why has nobody written this book? And obviously, I would like to write it. What do you think? And she was receptive, but not, it has to be said, wildly enthusiastic initially. And then she kind of discussed it with some of her colleagues, and then the enthusiasm really built. And she said, well, why don't you knock up something for me, just a kind of a couple of chapters or a proposal, and we'll see how we go with it. And I'm really glad that I took it that way for a number of reasons, because, I mean, all of us started life inside this organ, clearly. roughly half of us have one. And the uterus is, I would argue, the most medicated, managed, controversial, legislated, and yet misunderstood organ in the human body. Everybody has an opinion about what wombs should do, can do, what should happen inside them, how we should manage them, laws surrounding them. And yet most people probably couldn't find one on a diagram. A lot of people don't even know that womb and uterus is the same thing. It's just two words for the same organ. I mean, we really have to get right down to brass tacks. And then, most people have no idea of really the physiological life cycle of the uterus and what we can learn from it. And it's a vastly under-researched area. When I started researching the book, I was speaking to scientists who were doing mind-blowing work about what the womb actually does and what we can learn from it, how its processes work and don't work, new ways of diagnosing and managing disease, fertility, conception, all these kinds of fields. It's such an unsung organ and an underfunded, under-resourced area. And beyond that, as I wrote the book, I started to realize that understanding the womb isn't just about physiology and, going back to science class. It's much more than that. I realized actually what I was writing a book about was human rights, because anytime you're talking about reproductive health, the uterus, what it does, what it should do, what it can't do, it comes down to human rights and it comes down to bodily autonomy. And that really, to me, is the point of this book. Yes, it's about educating and informing and hopefully entertaining people. And it has lots of quirky facts in it and funny stories that I hope people will enjoy. But ultimately, I have to get on my soapbox a little bit and say that it really is about understanding that the uterus is the front line of human rights in this world. And the way that we look at reproductive rights is really the mark of how just and equitable we are as a society. So that's where I ended up going with it in the end, really.
It's an endlessly fascinating book, and there's so many quirky facts and really fascinating studies, as you sort of alluded to as well, that are going on at the moment, like using menstrual effluent to predict and diagnose illnesses and bacteria, like harnessing the power of bacteria and things like that. It's all like really, really interesting stuff. Like, did you find out about anything that sort of particularly excited you in the field of research?
Yeah, I mean, I thought at the outset of writing the book, obviously in order for me to pitch the book, I had to kind of position myself as a bit of an expert, or at least persuade a few people that I was, right? And I thought, being a midwife and mother and person with uterus, that's pretty problematic on even the best day. I thought that I knew quite a bit about the uterus and I kind of could map out where I'd be going with the book. But I really have to say that at least 80 to 90% of what is in the book was a complete surprise to me. On a kind of personal level, and I'm quite open about this in the book, I've always suffered with incredibly heavy, painful periods to the point that it's now, debilitating at least a couple of days a month for me. And I very much grew up with the idea that periods were just yucky and, the blood is just a hassle. It doesn't, you can't glean anything good from having a period.
No, we just taught to just chuck it away, aren't you? You have your tampon, you have your pad, you chuck it away, you don't look at it. That's that, right?
Chuck it away. It's dirty. It's got nothing to teach us or tell us about what's happening. And like so many women and people with wombs, I've gone through years of, painful, distressing, invasive investigations to try and work out what's happening. I actually still don't have any answers. I've been on the gynae waiting list for over a year, which is another story entirely. And what I learned from speaking to a couple of scientists in the book is that this menstrual tissue that we just think of as a nuisance and we just flush away or bin away rather, it actually, each person's menstrual flow has a unique biochemical fingerprint. It's not just red blood cells, it's immune cells, it's, little bits of endometrial tissue, but it also has maybe viral fragments in it and, elements of the vaginal microbiome, which is a whole other sort of story. And so each person's menstrual blood is just as unique and potentially can tell us just as much as what we call venous peripheral blood, the blood that you get taken from your arm when you go to the doctor for a blood test. And I spoke to a really fascinating scientist in America who is getting women to collect their menstrual blood in cups or pads. They then send it to the lab to be analysed. And what she's able to do, and she's actually shown that it's remarkably effective so far, is accurately predict or diagnose just from the menstrual samples who might have endometriosis, which is a debilitating disease that on average takes about 7 to 10 years at the moment to be diagnosed and takes lots of really costly and painful interventions. And I spoke to a number of scientists who are doing sort of similar work in that area. And to me, just on a personal level, that was mind-blowing, because I thought, I know I suffer with this issue. I know so many other people who do. And to think that instead of enduring these long waits and these procedures and the not knowing and the distress and having to miss work and all the rest of it, I could just send my tampon into a lab. And there's even technology being developed that can analyze, a sanitary product like a tampon or a pad and send that data to your phone. I mean, that's really the frontier that we're looking at. And yet, the scientists that I spoke to said that because this stuff is kind of yucky, funding bodies are very loath to research it. And they also don't think that women will participate in these studies when we know that, actually the opposite is true. So although I found out lots of really interesting stuff in the book around pregnancy and birth, which kind of, I enjoy because obviously I'm a midwife and I found the history of all that quite fascinating. On a personal note, I found the work around periods and what we can learn from them really, really interesting and promising. Maybe not for me, but maybe for my daughter's generation.
We obviously know, you've touched on there about research, and there's a huge gap in research around women and medicine, and we know about that, and we talk about on the podcast quite a lot about medical misogyny, the gender pain gap. But I was really shocked by some of the language that you outline in the book, which I don't think this gets talked about very much. And when you think about it, we've all heard these expressions, these terms thrown around, incompetent and lazy and things like that, to describe bits of the female reproductive system that aren't working as perhaps you might like them to be. The point you make is that we don't do that in any other area of medicine. I was really shocked about that.
As a service user and also as a person working within the NHS, I've heard all kinds of really quite shocking language directed at women when their bodies haven't worked according to plan. So just a few examples. Some women who are struggling to conceive have been told they have a hostile uterus. That's one I heard quite a few times in the book. Lots of women whose labours don't go to plan are labelled with failure to progress or weak or ineffective contractions. And a big one that I talk about in the book is very sadly when some women suffer pregnancy loss because the cervix has opened or dilated too soon. They're told they have an incompetent cervix. And that is actually the official terminology for what's happened. And in no other field of medicine would doctors have free license to use such derogatory and really kind of personalized terms to describe something that's just a physiological process. I mean, somebody actually commented on Instagram to me the other day, after I was speaking about this on the radio, if a man had a heart attack, you wouldn't say, well, you've got an incompetent heart. You just wouldn't, or if he couldn't get an erection, they wouldn't say weak penis, or, it just, we nowadays.
God, can you imagine the insult?
I mean, really?
Wow.
Yeah, you've got, ads and posters everywhere you go for erectile dysfunction. You don't say, sad penis or, bad testes. But I jest, but it's to make a point really, is that we don't really think anything of it, that we're labeling women and people with wombs with these really quite nasty terms that have their origins in real misogynistic roots of medicine. And when we could quite easily come up with totally neutral yet accurate terminology. In the chapter when I'm talking about an incompetent cervix, I say, well, why don't we just use preterm dilatation of the cervix or, some other term that just describes the thing that's happening? And I think a lot of your listeners and a lot of readers of the book will unfortunately have been on the receiving end of this kind of terminology. And it really wouldn't take very much at all for us to change this. But the language that we use, it says so much about how we feel about things and people and bodies. So it's a sad marker of kind of where we are as a society that this language is still used.
it's so commonly used, isn't it? It's like I've definitely heard those terms before. You know, I've had a baby myself. I've definitely heard women's bodies referred to in those terms, but I've never even really thought about it. Like, oh, that's, you know, oh, that's not very nice. But I think there is still, and always has been, quite a lot of shame attached to women's bodies and women's sexuality and reproductive systems and things like that. And I'm not too proud to admit that, you know, at the age of 40, if I were in an office, I would probably still go to the toilet with a tampon tucked up my sleeve. It would feel like a real, like, Billy Big Balls kind of a move to be like, right, lads, you know, I'm off kind of thing. But, like, do you think that that is changing for the younger generations? Because chat about periods, for example, is so much more widespread now than it was when I was a kid. There's a lot of discussion about things like period poverty. And also, like, you can go to a toilet, you know, at a football ground, and quite often now there will be sanitary products there that are free to use. Do you think that the system is changing for younger people? You know, you've talked about the womb being at the sort of front line of human rights, reproductive rights, etc., etc. Do you think there are other areas where we're kind of like regressing? Where do you think we're at?
I mean, it's a really interesting question. I feel like there are some glimmers of hope for the younger generation. I mean, my daughters are 16 and 20, and they speak much more openly with their girlfriends about periods, contraception, sex, bodies, all those kinds of things than I ever would have done. I think a lot of that is maybe around social media, because there are, you know, huge discourses about this stuff on TikTok and Instagram, and it's just become kind of part of the scenery for them. I also live in Scotland, where we have free period products in schools, universities, and, you know, public libraries and things. So that helps to make it a bit more visible and accessible. But I'm aware that they're quite privileged to be moving in those circles and to be living in Scotland and, you know, to be educated, white, healthy young women. And it's, you know, it's not that way for everyone. And on the flip side of this, you know, here's me as a 45-year-old perimenopausal woman, having just written a book about the womb. And so much of what I've read and is happening in the world recently just makes me really depressed and feels like we are actually just going backwards. I mean, just in the last week alone, a judge in America is on the brink of ruling to outlaw mifepristone, which is a really important medication that's used not only for abortions, but to terminate septic pregnancies. It's used also in cancer treatment as well. It's a huge threat to bodily autonomy. We've had a report released by the UN saying that maternal mortality in pregnancy and childbirth around the world, this is between 2016 and 2020, has actually regressed or stagnated in most places. So every 2 minutes around the world, a woman dies a preventable death in pregnancy and childbirth. That's the most recent report. We've had the actual Minister for Women and Equality stand up in Parliament and say that menopause leave is a left-wing policy. Yeah.
Oh, God.
So, yeah, let's get into it. I mean, look, it's tempting just to go, oh, it's too awful. I can't even contemplate it. But actually, when you start tuning into this stuff, you realize it's everywhere, and it's actually pretty dire. So yes, although I hope that the younger generation are a bit more switched on and maybe things will change, we've got a lot of work to do. We have to get everybody on board with reproductive rights and bodily autonomy, and that means women and men, and, you know, conservatives and liberals and people in the developing world and the developed world. And that's a huge task. It's not going to be easy.
That kind of leads on slightly to the last question I wanted to ask you, because I noticed that you tweeted the other day about, as a non-fiction writer, there's a new prize, the non-fiction women's prize, that they're looking for a sponsor at the moment to go alongside the women's prize for fiction, sponsored by Bailey's. Always love that about it.
Yeah, now in pink. Now in added pink for more joy. Yeah.
Matches my nails, so that's lovely. I wanted to ask you, as a non-fiction writer, and the statistics around men particularly reading non-fiction works by women are dire. And you talked before about your agent when you took this idea to her and she wasn't initially like massively enthused by it. As someone who has had dealings with publishers and pitching stuff to them, I feel like there's a very narrow view about what people might be interested in. What are the challenges in terms of like getting people to even publish work like this? Because they must immediately be like, well, you know, no man is going to read that. I don't think that's
Yeah.
true, by the way. I think some men will, but it's...
Yeah, very few.
Well...
Yeah. I mean, it's weird for me because I'm in an interesting position because I'm a midwife. Like, that's my USP in a way. I hate using terms like brand and whatever, but I guess because I'm putting forth a commercial product, i.e. books, that is my brand. I'm a midwife. I write about women's health and reproductive and gynae health. So people expect that from me. So when I take an idea to my agent or she pitches something to publishers, they already know that that's what they're going to get from me. So I, much as I might love to go and write, a book about, I don't know, traveling or politics or food or something else, I know that that's not going to work from me. I kind of have to stay to some degree in my lane, and that's fine, because that's the brand that I've created. Where it becomes a little bit tricky is, as you've alluded to, kind of bringing in a wider audience that might include men. And I know that most of my readers won't be men, and that's okay. But what's been interesting over the last few weeks, we've obviously been doing promo for the book, and I've been very lucky to get lovely feedback from many female authors and journalists and public persona, and that's been great. I've had a couple of lovely quotes in print and on radio from men who've read the book or are excited about the book. And the mileage that I've been able to get out of those men's words compared to the lovely things that women have said about me has been pretty incredible. And we were actually talking about that with my editor and publicist the other day when I was down in London doing stuff for the book. And we all just kind of agreed, like, yeah, it kind of sucks, but it's just a sad fact of being in this industry that what men say about your book sometimes counts for a bit more. And I hate that, but I kind of have to play that game a little bit. And I don't know if that will ever change for nonfiction. I mean, you go into Waterstones or Foyles or whatever, your local indie bookshop, and the nonfiction table is groaning with books by men about smart thinking, whatever that means, and great ideas, and historical stuff about other white dudes. And it's going to take a lot to change that. There are some structural issues in nonfiction publishing that unfortunately, I have to exist within.
Right, Leah. So your book, Womb, Inside Story of Where We All Began, is published now by Virago. Available, I assume, in all good bookshops and online.
All of them.
And it's a fascinating read. There's just so much information in it. It's like, you're just like, flipping heck, who knew? So thank you very much for chatting to me. Where can we follow you on socials so readers can keep up to date? And are you doing any events around the publication of the book that people can sort of sign up for?
I am on the socials. I'm on Twitter at @hazard_Leah, and I am on Instagram at Leah Hazard, all one word. You can also visit my website if you are a super fan. That is leahhazard.co.uk, and you can get in touch with me via the contact form on that website if you have something exciting to say. And yeah, I pop up in the media pretty regularly, for better or for worse. Like to comment and run my mouth on all issues relating to maternity, midwifery, women's health. So you might hear me in that capacity as well.
Leah, thank you very much for joining me.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.